Okay, good morning. Miguel Rescalvo here from Agent Consulting. I'm really happy to see so many people here this morning. By now, I thought that we really thought yesterday that we were going to be alone with three of you. So either the party yesterday was not as good as you thought, or you are really committed to learn what's going to be the carbon market landscape in the next 12 or 15 years. First of all, I want to give a big thanks to the World Bank for allowing us to organize this event in the very last minute. Also to UNDP and GGGI to inviting me to moderate this fantastic panel. In the last almost 3 days, we've been hearing a lot where we are, where the voluntary market is reaching or going below a bond to $2 billion in different type of deals. I'm sure we also yesterday being announcement for investment banks of committing $200 billion for removal credits in the next, I don't know how many years. We heard how different countries are starting to advance in establishing regulatory policy and institutional frameworks to make Article 6.2 a reality. We also got updates on where the work to make Article 6.4 work in the next months or years is going. We heard a lot about new technologies to make sure that transactional costs decreases, that transparency increases, and we make sure that environmental integrity is preserved. With digital MRV, with climate action data trust from the World Bank, and we also saw how new players are starting to be active in this market, right? So we heard about rating agencies being interested in rating carbon units, what we didn't have before, right? In the Kyoto times, we heard how we've seen in the last couple of years a secondary market being activated for carbon market that we didn't have either. So the question today is, what do we want to see happening in the next 10, 12 years to 2035? For that, we have a fantastic panel to give their ideas. I'm sure you know most, if not all of them. Fenella One from GGGI, Alexandra Soesser from UNDP, Marlene Albert from the government of Germany, Niels Westing from the Swedish Energy Agency, Andrea Bonsani from AITA, Benedict von Butler from Evolution Environmental, and Chandra, I'm sure that's the one all of you know very well. So anyway, the first question to them is very simple. Let's get this crystal ball out of your bags and let's think together, what's your dream carbon markets, and specifically, what do you think Article 6 could look like in 2035? What would be for you the perfect situation that we say we can all convey here in 2035 and say, yes, we made it. It's exactly what we had in this session in Bilbao, the last day in the last minutes. So for starting with that, I'm asking for any volunteer. I think Andrea volunteered before the opening, right?
I can go.
Volunteer to be the last one, but okay, we are reversing the order. So please, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Miguel. There's pros and cons in being first. Well, I can say whatever I want. I won't be repeating what the other panelists say, but it's also a responsibility to set the tone for the session. So in 2035, first of all, I like the carbon market to be much, much bigger than what it is now. It's necessary if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. As you probably know, AITA has been running scenarios with the University of Maryland for several years now. And in all scenarios, the size of the market, if we want to achieve the NDCs, if we want to reach net zero in the second half of the century, will be hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And at the moment, we are about $2 billion. So it's a massive step up in scale. And in order to achieve that, we need some large-scale sovereign demand. Now, there's the voluntary market that's been growing significantly. There are a few countries that are engaging with markets. The big one is Japan. The biggest one is Japan, but we really need the largest economic blocs. We need the EU, we need the US, we need China to seriously engage with markets. And we know we're not there yet, but if we want to have a market that is meaningful in the fight against climate change by 2035, we need to start much earlier with that sort of demand. And then the other feature of the market that I like to see is fungibility. I like to have products that are fungible. Now we have too much fragmentation, and that's not how a well-functioning market should develop. So there are initiatives, we can talk about it later in the panel, there are initiatives that are getting us there, but it's very important that these are successful if then we want the market to play the role that it has to play.
Thank you, thank you. So a larger market, a bigger role for large jurisdictions. You mentioned Japan being very active now, but we want to see more of the European Union, more of US and others. You mentioned the need of fungibility, decrease and make sure that those initiatives can be somehow linked or talk to each other and move climate action together. Very good. So maybe, Fanela, from GGGI, you are helping many countries to really put in place the architecture to make Article 6 a reality. Where do you think those countries should go in 10 years from now? What would make those countries really attractive partners for donors and large institutions to count on them? Okay.
First of all, I thought the IETA party was very good, and that's why I nearly lost my voice this morning, so I apologize. Well, if we've done everything right, I should be out of a job and retired, and the market is happily going on, because we're just there at the point of trying to open things up. So apart from being on a beach in a desert island in 2035, I will say a vibrant market. And when I mean vibrant, all the things you say, Andre, the fungibility, the derivatives models, the different elements of saying that's a guaranteed delivery, that's not a guaranteed delivery, so as we have primary and secondary markets. So there are risk takers, market makers, who could be the large energy companies, as I think they'll be the first ones active in the market. I think the banks will be slower, but will come back. Securitization is what I really want to see. I really want to see the ability to lend money in advance of receiving a flow of income generated from carbon credits. I think we will be not talking about voluntary or compliance. I think that will fade much sooner, actually. So it will be, what kind of credit is it? And it will just be with or without a corresponding adjustment. There won't be all of this huge amount of work we're having to do now on the, what if you do this box in the initial report, and then you do this, and then you do that. Will all become an accounting reporting thing by 2035. It will all be fairly automatic. Countries, some will be organized, some selling countries will be organized. They will have secretariats that are tasked to do the job of smoothing the accounting for international carbon trading and administering it. I can think immediately, if we think of someone like TGO in Thailand, you know, they've already developed. There'll be more of those around. And countries that aren't organized and don't put these things in place will fall behind and will miss out. So, yeah, I'm hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Very easy to summarize this, and actually, Alexandra and I agree with you. We were just discussing before we started that where we should be in 2035 is in an island already retired, right? So I think we are there. We were in the right track, at least I agree on that. But yeah, more fungibility, securitization, being able to bring financial flows to good deals, someone the risk in that operation that allows us to scale it up, right? To go from relatively small operations to the hundreds of millions of operations in the context of Article 6, right? And then very interesting, stop the discussion, voluntary regulated units without corresponding adjustment, go beyond that discussion to, okay, that will be an accounting feature, but we are over that. So I see Chandra there that wants to jump in specifically on that topic, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel and Fenella. I didn't know we had total agreement on this idea of simplifying the market, not talking about Article 6, but talking about the market, which will deal in two types of units, as opposed to worrying about the fragmentation of the market. We just talk about what are the units that you will have. You will have a compliance unit and you will have a voluntary unit. Let me explain. I think Fenella indicated that a voluntary unit has no commitment for corresponding adjustment by the host country, and a compliance unit, by definition, has. Clearly, the role for compliance units is going to be significant, as Andrea pointed out. Even if you look at today's NDCs for 2030, which are not very ambitious, there's still an opportunity for $250 to $300 billion a year of saving through the use of cooperation between countries. Part of that can be translated into the size of the market. Post-2030, we are going to have harmonized, much more ambitious NDCs, and the opportunities will be greater. So there will be an opportunity for countries to cooperate amongst themselves in return for transfer of compliance units, and to recognize that the host country has an opportunity cost for generating units, because at a lower part of the compliance part of the market, and the final marginal ton for achieving compliance are going to be dramatically different in the case of ambitious NDCs, because the marginal abatement cost curve always slopes upwards. If it sloped any other way, we wouldn't have a climate problem. It slopes up. So if you sell at a lower part of the marginal abatement cost curve and have to adjust your NDC at the higher level, there's an opportunity cost. And that opportunity cost, even for 2030 NDCs, are greater than $25 a ton for most countries. So what is the implication of this on a voluntary unit versus a compliance unit? A voluntary unit reflects no commitment on the opportunity cost, and therefore the private sector could use it for its compensation requirements, whereas if the private sector or corporate has a commitment which requires it to use a compliance unit, which we hear in many cases in Europe, if it is to use a compliance unit, then you have to recognize that that $25 or $50 in 2030, if I'm to use a crystal ball, would have a totally different thinking around how you use voluntary versus compliance units. That's number one. Number two, to recognize that voluntary units are going to be the dominant source of international climate finance. Because broadly, the global north has not met its obligations as far back as Copenhagen for providing appropriate level of climate finance. And that potentially the private sector can play a greater role in providing that in the absence of the ability of most of our sovereign partners in the context of the crisis and fiscal situations that exist. It's unrealistic to expect large amount of public climate finance. Therefore, to recognize explicitly that there's an opportunity here to help speed up the transition that the previous panel was discussing. That's the second. The third then is, how do you manage this concern with regard to integrity by allowing non-correspondingly adjusted or voluntary units to meet the corporate commitments? I would argue that you have to very explicitly get into a discussion of the qualitative difference between scope 1 and 2 emission and scope 3 emissions. And that the starting point for the voluntary market should be voluntary units going towards Scope 3 emissions. Now we can have a good discussion around which of the Scope 3 emissions of which industries would be acceptable. But very clearly, the starting point of getting to 2035 as market at scale has to be a discussion around the fact that Scope 3 emissions should be the entry point for voluntary units. And that creates the basis for us having a more serious discussion and figuring out how much of the Scope 3 emissions are we able to address, how much climate finance that relates, and how much of that climate finance through voluntary units can come from the carbon markets. There are a lot of other things in terms of the infrastructure, policy, other things that I can get into, but I think this, for me, is the big picture.
Very good and very interesting. So simplified markets, right? Going really into the discussion of what voluntary units can be used for, should be used for, and 2035 they should be, if I got it correctly, the mainstay for Scope 3 emissions offsetting in the corporate world. And then let's make the compliance units the mainstream for climate finance among jurisdictions, right? So we have a few words already about how we want to see the market in 2035, right? First one, a couple of panelists agreed on the fungibility, the need to make things that coordinate actions and make and scale it up. Securitization to raise more and significant money. A simplified market where there's clarity in what the voluntary units are used for and the compliance units are used for. And the best word of the morning has been something around vacations, right, or holidays. Yeah. That we are all retired by that time because job is done, not because we are too old. We will always be young anyway. Okay, someone escaped from the panel because they didn't want to go next.
He hasn't got a microphone, he's just realized.
But we have a couple of countries representatives sitting here that I'm sure they have an opinion on. Do you see also this being the how things should work in 2035, the differentiation between voluntary units, compliance units, these really may be able to scale up Article 6, the fungibility aspect among jurisdictions, or do you think this is too complicated, that it's better to keep working individually to make sure that we have a few countries here and there where you can help them to do good projects for them and for you, and that is good enough? Where do you see this going in 12 years from now? For example, in the case of Sweden.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say I really like my job, and even if we're very successful, I hope I can still keep my job by 2035. We also have good public holidays, right? Sweden.
No need to be retired, right?
Exactly. It's nicer to work and have time to relax as well. So I agree with most of what has been said here. I definitely. So I wrote up 3 points. One is about the fragmentation and the sort of the market going generally in the direction of more confusion right now, and I hope that it will turn around, and that we would make things more and more similar, and that we would learn from each other, and yeah, like other speakers have said. Then I think one important point that has not been brought up, and that is definitely very important in a Swedish context, but I think in other countries as well, is public support. I think that's very much key to have a successful market, that the public understands what this market is about, and that they, I mean, in the case of Sweden, that they see that we purchase emission reductions, most from other countries, and it actually does good for the host countries. That sort of connects to what Chandra said about the opportunity cost, which I'm always a bit uncomfortable with thinking about the opportunity cost. I would like Sweden to aim to buy emission reduction units that are high enough on the marginal abatement cost curve that there basically would not be an opportunity cost. I think you will object, so please do that later. But regarding public support, I mean, also for companies that their customers understand that buying a product that has been using offsets is a better product than one that hasn't. That obviously means that the offsets have to be of very high quality. And then my third point was actually about technological development, because I think I'm quite enthusiastic about technological removals, and I would hope that by 2035 we would have picked a lot of the sort of the low-hanging fruit. The price levels for sort of classic removals would go up because supply is going down, and that technological development in sort of the removals space has made prices go down, so they would be more competitive. So that's
very good. So confusion is the first word I heard, but I hope that it's not that in 2035 we want to have more confusion. Right?
No, we want to have less confusion.
Eliminate the confusion. But that's why maybe he doesn't want to retire by that time, because of the level of confusion. But we work against that, right? So no confusion, total clarity, society buy-in. People need to understand why this is important, why the best option many times is to support emission reductions or removals in other countries, right? And that is also good for the society in general and for them domestically, right? And technology development. How do we use Article 6 carbon markets to advance those technologies that has a high cost and that the developing countries, host countries, would not they cannot develop themselves, and the risk for the private sector without these type of approaches would be too high, right? So Malin, in your role in the government of Germany, I mean, I know I guess you spend a good part of your time in the nitty-gritties of the negotiations, right? and we've been in some meetings together where 2 days were invested in one sentence in a document, right? So how does all of this sound to you? For more from inside the negotiations, how do you see the international community dreaming of a 2035 carbon market? What do you really think can be achieved by 2035?
Yeah, I would like to start with the argument that we are now in a probably confusing or very complex world. I believe that the carbon market as a whole, which includes also compliance, voluntary market, and domestic carbon pricing schemes, I believe that we will have a significant higher number of domestic carbon pricing schemes worldwide. And within these schemes, there will be different kinds of national crediting schemes for, I believe, that countries will also combine their tax or ETS with kind of allowing credits coming in to reduce their burden. And in this regard, and I believe also that these national credit schemes will in 2030 use Article 6.4 as a knowledge source for their standards. So there will be a conversion of standards globally, I believe. At the same time, I think also that there will be more and more regional collaboration or linking among countries, which means that they either agree on to link via their crediting scheme or via their domestic carbon pricing scheme. So we will see less fragmentation, I would say, but a much more multi-layer carbon market within one country. So that makes it maybe still a little bit complex. And in regard to the Article 6.2 and 6.4, I'm not sure whether I should really distinguish with that, but I would call it international transfer of mitigation outcomes. I believe that as the carbon price of the domestic schemes will raise, and at the same time, the cost for specific technologies, especially in the technical removal technology, I believe that this will go, or I hope that it will go down. So, and at the same time, countries will have a very clear picture, hopefully, as we have provided a lot of capacity building to all countries, that they exactly know what parts of their NDC are they able to sell and willing to sell. So yes, that's more. So there will be, of course, other activities like, of course, forest agriculture, but also enhanced weathering, CCSU and other activities within Article 6. And yes, so I stop here.
Okay, very good. So very interesting remarks. See, this multi-layer structuring of the carbon market with domestic schemes complementing, so the domestic carbon pricing, including domestic crediting schemes, right, that need to then be allowed maybe for transactions with other international jurisdiction. The need again for fungibility, right, higher collaboration, and the need for capacity building. Or by 2035, all the capacity building we need to dream of being already done. All the countries are expert and this work smoothly, right? So we have in the panel also the private sector, right? A project developer who it would be very interesting to see what do you want to see from all of these people by 2035, right?
Yeah, I just realized I'm kind of the lonely private sector.
That was never the intention.
But with a microphone now. So maybe to take a step back, because it's an illustrious panel and a lot of people know that, and I'm kind of an unknown entity here, but I do have a bit of experience because pretty much exactly 20 years ago, not only did we structure the very first ever EUA transaction in the European scheme, but also the very first ever AAU transaction between Slovakia and Japan. And since then, it's been 20 years in the carbon market, and I've transacted CERs and EUAs and AAUs and ERUs. And I'm saying this because now this is a bit of a déjà vu. And a corresponding adjustment is nothing else than we had under Kyoto Agreement, where countries had AAUs, and then you had a project developer doing a JI project, and the JI project transferred ERUs, and the government had to transfer AAUs, a correspondingly adjusted transfer of government units. Yeah. Exact same thing, 20 years ago, and here we are 20 years later still figuring out, you know, how this can work. The difference is it's over the last years, at least the ETS, which was kind of the only bigger buying market for project-based reduction, was fairly simple. So we had a CER as a CER, whether it's from biogas in China or for wind in Mexico, it's pretty simple. And so we had one unit, very easy, and we had enforcement. And so that brings me to the point, maybe from a market perspective, what makes a market actually happen, right? And successfully happen with risk management and everything. So to start off, emissions trading doesn't reduce emissions. I mean, that's an important thing. It sounds so obvious, but it's, you know, emissions trading doesn't reduce emissions. It's the cap that does. Emissions trading is always a zero-sum game. And so the enforcement is really the cap. And then emissions trading is a tool to make the cost efficiency bigger. So in the end, political acceptability of an emissions cap is higher because it costs less than just having taxes or fixed prices on carbon. And so, but emissions trading doesn't reduce emissions. It's a means to an end. And so to crystallize the efficiency of emissions trading, I have to measure the efficiency as a private sector. And so I need three components really in the trading scheme. One is I need to know my internal cost, my marginal abatement cost curve. Then there needs to be a stick, an enforcement mechanism, like in the ETS. It says if you don't reduce emissions, you have to pay a penalty, and you still have to reduce your emissions. So whatever my cost is, I know I'm on the hook to reduce. And then there's a unit that gets me out of jail and saying, well, my internal cost is 100, but here's a unit that I can buy for anything below 100 that saves me this cost, and therefore I'm willing to pay it. And these are three components that are just necessary for the market, which leads me to the point is, when do we have that? One is the cap. Right now we had before we had ETS or Europe and AAUs and Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, and now suddenly there's almost no more distinction. So first we have to fix and saying, what's the global cap? And once we have a cap, how do we actually enforce it? And once we enforce it, what's my out of jail unit to say my internal cost is 100, so I'm willing to pay 80. But I'm only willing to do that if the unit that I buy at 80 is actually valid to get out of jail and not doing the 100. And so as we move up, I need certainty, right? And that's really the big part also, I think, also from conversations here, that's holding back a lot of capital, which is not just, let's say, emitters, because emitters want to reduce cost of their compliance, right? They want to spend as little money as possible for the emission reductions, but there's a big pool of capital investors who are willing to invest $100 million in something, but they also need some certainty that this is not kind of disappearing. And so I think, coming back to the question of where do I see the market 25, 30, 35, I think the next 2 years, or maybe longer, we have to sort out precisely these questions. What's the valid compliance unit? What is the enforcement mechanism? What's the definition? Because this CDM was 2 DHS and now we have 3 DHS. We have all sorts of legislations, we have all sorts of units, we have all sorts of technologies. That needs to be sorted out. I think towards 2030, so I think the market might linger a little bit because of all this political uncertainty. Then I think towards 2030, where a lot of companies have targets and governments as well, and there's political pressure increasing, and there's climate headlines, and all the Fridays for Future generations are suddenly voters. And I think this is where the rubber hits the road, where suddenly people realize we got to do something. And there will be budgets for emission reductions, there's reporting requirements, there's auditing, that zero stakeholders, investors are coming saying, hey, what have you done? And there's budgets going to be freed up to buy good units, but then they will realize that in order to create the supply is the 3-4 year time lag until these units actually come to market. So the existing units the good units might increase wildly in price. And there's a bit of a hype like we had at the beginning of Kyoto, where everybody was also hyped. But it's a bit kind of a panic reaction, like a knee-jerk reaction. Then all the investors come in. And then hopefully by 2035, we will have, like you said, more like a commoditized market where there's actually, people know what they buy, there's streams, you can hedge. People have the internal cost curve and saying, you know, my abatement cost is 100, but if I buy this unit for 80, that's fine. And so they allocate capital. Important aspect, hedging, the time dimension, where they say, I have a predictable SBTI trajectory, my internal abatement costs are going to go up over time. I need somebody to provide me a 5-year stream, not more than 50. I need a buyer that gives me a 10-year stream of a predictable price for risk management. A seller can only do that if they know that what they sell is valid, so they run a risk. For this, I need portfolio management. But for this, I also need to know that the government is not suddenly saying this is not worth, or you can't export it or whatever. Otherwise, I can't offer that hedge. So all of this needs to fall into place. And hopefully by 2035, we have carbon sorted out. And by that, we have biodiversity credits and maybe some water credits. And the whole commoditization of environmental assets is a bit more advanced.
Very interesting. So we went now to 2045, right? But leaving it at 2035, a commoditized market again, right? So a market where everyone knows what to buy and sell, and there's not so much fuss about the nitty-gritty of the processes, right? But really promoting these transactions, you refer to a global cap that gives a clear signal to the players that they need to act, and there is a penalty behind that. And for those who may not have been around for so long in the carbon market, at the beginning you referred to a very important aspect, that trading that do not reduce emissions by itself, right? You need the cap and you need the penalty to make it happen, right? So Alexandra, you didn't want to be the first, but you didn't tell me you wanted to be the last one. So sorry for that. But you are also working in many countries in Africa, Latin America, the Pacific, helping them to really navigate these short-term scenarios, right? Where they see themselves a little bit trapped in, okay, we have our NDC, we have the private sector knocking the door with for forestry with quite a significant amount of money, right? We have a country that want to have corresponding adjustment with us, but for that we need, cooperative approaches, but for that we need to do all of this work on capacity building and all of that. So from your experience, what do they want, what do they need to see from all of these players in the panel to really say, okay, this is the direction. These are the 3 steps we are going to do from now to 2035, and here is where we want to be. All of these countries, what's your dream about the carbon market in these domestic countries that you are supporting in 10 years from now?
Okay, thanks, Miguel. Yeah, I would have really hoped not to be the last one because I am more critical about the carbon market and its development than probably most of the other panelists. I mean, I see some really structural challenges in Article 6 because of some requirements, for example, that it must have to be generated and used within one NDC cycle, which makes it really extremely challenging for private sector to invest in more sophisticated technologies, something that we all want to see outside the forestry sector. We really want to see investment in new technologies, which is, especially if we want to see also a financial additional project being implemented within the short time frame that we have, almost impossible. And the other challenge that I see is that most of the countries that are currently interested in Article 6 and carbon markets are countries with very little mitigation potential outside the forestry sector. So most of the countries that we are supporting have very little opportunities to actually mitigate emission reductions at scale. And those countries that are potentially interested in the future, like India, they have very high and very complex technologies on their priority list, which might then again not be implemented within the time frame we have for Article 6. This is one NDC cycle. And then I also see challenges with authorizations because of the political risk. So for many private sector investors, it will be difficult to invest in projects where there is such a high political uncertainty about the authorizations. And when it comes to voluntary versus compliance, there are so many different initiatives at the moment and messages that we give to countries among development partners also, which makes it very confusing for countries to decide which path to go. And then at the same time, some jurisdictions try to guide their private sector already in how to use claims in the future. So it will become more difficult for companies to use claims for their own offsetting, and instead of that it will be really pure contribution. So it seems to be a shift of responsibility to provide climate finance to countries from governments to private sector. So yeah, I hope that there will be less different messages from development partners in the future to host countries and more interest from larger countries in carbon markets.
Very good. So that last sentence is perfect, right? Less confusion, more clarity, more interest from larger emitters, right? So we have a few minutes left. We've heard very interesting statements that we can summarize in a few words. I'm sorry for taking so many notes, but I'm getting old, looking forward this retirement in 10 years. So anyway, we want a market in 2035 that is fungible, right? That allows the securitization, the risking to bring a large amount of capital. We want a simplified market in 10 years to come, forgetting about this never-ending discussion now about voluntary market, compliance market, corresponding adjustment, that sincerely what we see in the work we do is really taking most of the energy from the countries and for the donors and the supporting agencies, right? We want to speed up actions. We want to promote technology development, and that the market allows these high-cost technologies to be mainstream in these countries in 10 years from now. And we want to bring certainty in the market, right? So, okay, all of this is the Christmas tree wish list for 10 years from now. But some people in these, all of these people are both well known in the market and powerful actors in the market. So what can you do in the next 2 years to make this happen? Chandra, for example, from your perspective, what are the must-have in 2 years from now to go in the right direction?
I think the most important thing to do is to get clarity around the policies in countries for the different segments of the market, recognizing the longer-term view. I think all of our client countries, as far as the World Bank is concerned, need to have clarity that post-2030, we are moving towards a harmonized NDC with effective caps. I think you mentioned it, Benedict, that state actors will have one set of caps. This is commit and comply market. And the non-state actors will have pledge and comply market. That corporates will pledge a net zero goal and will have to comply with it because their shareholders will make them, hold them accountable. And to develop a set of policies, clear policies, helped by Alex and Fenella and all of us, that clearly recognizes that there are opportunities here for cooperation under the compliance regime, which is commit and comply, where I hope to follow up with Niels that he will buy only beyond the NDC cost and of a country. For cooperation, if you're going to buy on the right of the mitigation cost curve point for the NDC, that would be fantastic for countries and for the climate. And in the case of voluntary players, to recognize that your cost curve, internal cost curve for scope 1 and 2 can be defined, but not for your scope 3. And therefore, scope 3, we are going to allow a different type of accounting process. So getting basic elements of the key parts that will drive the market, I think is going to be the most important thing to do. Because right now, as everybody has said, there were too many issues, there are too many considerations. Let's have clarity on the policy that countries need to put in place and infrastructure that is needed to be put in place, the institutional, the registries and so on, in order to implement that infrastructure in a market strategy in a transparent manner. That's the single in my mind.
Very interesting. So policy clarity, right? A clear message that post-2030 there is an harmonized NDC that trigger down both to jurisdictions and corporations in different forms and shape, but with a unifying policy approach for them. So Niels Malin, how do you see that you can support that process? First, do you agree that that's the priority in the next 2 years, like this policy clarity that embrace both corporates and states, or do you think that there is a different priority? And if so, what do you think is realistic to hope for that in the next couple of years?
Okay. Yes, I think that I agree with Chandra. I think, yes, to provide, or better to say, I would say, what can governments do to support that the market gets more clarity and certainty and also more credibility and trust. So I think what we are doing is to provide different kinds of capacity building for countries in order that they really get to know, or that they have a clear picture in which sector and in which and which activities are eligible for international trading, and also I think it's also important to support developing countries in order to also in regard to the voluntary carbon market, but because we recognize that they are quite confused about the different types of opportunities for the country. And the difference in regard to the Kyoto period I see is that now all host countries, should be really active player and also active in the to think about how they want to use which type of market segment. So for their climate and development goals. And also so to decide which is for the voluntary carbon market without corresponding adjustment, which means is it for the national market, or is it for international with a contribution claim, or for other activities with corresponding adjustment? Then you can think about also a higher price, I assume, and to think this really in detail through. That's one thing. And the second thing is, of course, also to support piloting of activities. So in the next couple of years. So yes, I stop here and give to you.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think it's very important. I mean, we have a responsibility to support host countries to develop their frameworks and their policies. I think Germany is doing an incredible job. We benefit from that since we are looking to buy it most. I also just wanted to react to what Chandra said. Yes, I definitely think it is our responsibility to purchase those that do not. I mean, it is important for us to not put host countries, NDCs, in danger, and that connects very well to how the cap needs to be effective for the market to work. I mean, it would be devastating, I think, if we would reach 2030 and host countries would say, "Oh, we didn't reach our NDCs. Too bad." I mean, that's when the cap starts evaporating, and that would be very terrible, I think.
Hands up.
Very good. So capacity building, different pricing signals for corresponding units, adjusted units or not, piloting in the next couple of years. So Fernela, we are really out of time. So one final remark on how GGGI can contribute to this dream for 2030.
I think the original question was, where do we think the market goes in 2025, 2030, 2035? So we gave the 2035. What is it going to be like in 2030 and in the next 2 years? So very briefly, I think corporates are going to run away temporarily. I think they've all been sold a lot of hokey and they don't understand, and they're saying, I want something that's totally robust. And at the moment, they don't know what that is. I think they'll come back and they'll take two approaches. They'll either do what some of the very large American corporates are doing and go non-market approaches. They want to go and help on the ground with projects. And others will say, I'm going to go with the market. And if they're going with the market and they're going to say they're net zero, then they need a correspondingly adjusted credit. If they're going to say they're contributing and they're making a claim, then they don't. I think there'll be a lot more development of national markets, as Marlon says. The ETS is linking. And I think there will be more purchase in country of non-correspondingly adjusted units. And I think the development between the ETS units and the international units will expand. It's what we all did 15 years ago. And, you know, where do you think they got the idea for the Paris Agreement? It all came from the joint implementation. And I think enforcement under the Paris Agreement, we haven't touched. It's all voluntary. I think that enforcement will come through the market. In 2030, countries that have not done what they should have done, are not complying with their NDC, will turn around, and the buyers and the other players in the market will stop them, and that's how we stopped HFC and large hydro in the CER market.
So So very interesting final remarks. So the market will organize itself in a few years from now. We will see corporates going away for a few years, coming back in a different shape and mode, some of them supporting the market, but with very different signals than today. I see Chandra there trying to jump from his seat. So do you any quick reaction when we are out?
No. I thought I'd spoken after you, so you couldn't come back at me.
Penella wants the last word. I'll let her have it.
No, Alexandra.
No, let's go.
Okay, very good. This was a very interesting panel. I want to thank all of you for being here, the World Bank for helping us to organize this in the last minute, GGGI UNDP for putting this together. Thanks for coming here and enjoy the rest of the day in I4C. Thank you.
Thank you.